the Toronto Star. I'm Sabah Itazaz, and this matters. We all know elections have consequences. And that might be exceptionally resounding for the United States, a country whose politics reach beyond its borders, and a lot of it right across the border into Canada. On the 3rd of November, Americans will be choosing whether Trump or Biden will be in charge for the next 4 years. And among other things, US immigration could look very different depending on who claims the Oval Office. US President Trump's aggressive immigration policies has had blowback effects on Canada. Will that change depending on who wins? Today, Edward Keenan, the Star's Washington bureau chief, joins me to discuss the upcoming elections through the lens of immigration policy and how Canada could be impacted. So, first of all, Ed, in broad terms, how do we currently compare the immigration policies of Canada and the US? Is there even a comparison?
In general terms, the Canadian government right now considers immigration to be a great asset of the country. They've been increasing legal paths to immigration, especially for skilled immigrants in technology and other sectors like that. They have targets that are significantly larger than they were just a few years ago for how many they want to accept into the country. And they say that they think those people are the fabric of Canada, become great Canadian citizens. Under Donald Trump, the United States has been moving in the opposite direction. A Republican strategist told me, I was writing a story about trade and tariffs at the time, but he said essentially, Donald Trump's really unpredictable, but there are two issues on which he is overwhelmingly consistent. And whatever the policy, he'll consider higher tariffs to be a good thing and lower immigration to be a good thing. For his base, he's propped that up. And so the U.S. has pursued dramatically lower immigration in two ways in the past almost 4 years. And one is by making it harder and less attractive for refugees, asylum seekers to come to the country. But the other is to limit the number of skilled immigrants that they will accept into the country and make it more difficult to get the kind of work visas and green cards that traditionally have been the pathway into the US. And so, in the broad strokes of like where the two governments stand, which direction they've been moving, what the trend of their policies over the past few years are, that's it.
I want to start with the skilled immigrant aspect first. If we focus solely on immigrants arriving from the US under the economic class, we see a big increase since 2015. And this is also since 2015, the Express Entry program was launched in Canada. And we've seen this figure now at over 10,000 people. That brings to mind the question, has Trump increased US immigration to Canada?
That's a difficult thing to exactly put your finger on. He's increased talk of Americans immigrating into Canada. There is plenty of talk about that. The numbers are not eye-popping. On the number of American citizens who've moved into Canada, you aren't blown away by some dramatic increase over the Obama years. It has gone up, but we're talking about single-digit percentages rather than tenfold increase. But especially in the last year, during which time Donald Trump, sometimes under the cover of the COVID crisis, sometimes other kind of like regulatory overhaul things, has suspended access to green cards for everyone, new applications, and dramatically limited the number of people who can come in on skilled worker visas. In the United States, they're like classifications like H-1B and so on. And basically, they've been tightening things up to make it harder and harder for people in other parts of the world who want to immigrate permanently or become permanent residents of North America and work in these big industries, harder for them to see a path to that in the United States. And so, as you mentioned, this sort of Canada's program of express entry for skilled immigrants was only launched in 2015. And what you see is sort of like upticks year upon year, which is what you'd expect in a new program. Basically, in 2017, there were about 5,000 immigrants who were residents of the United States applying for permanent residency in Canada under that. And that number has doubled in 2019 and likely continues to go up this year when those visas are harder to get. And so what we might understand for that, and it's not by any means, I haven't interviewed each and every one of those applicants and asked them what their reasoning was. But some of the experts I talked to say that likely what might be happening is that skilled immigrants who are on temporary visas in the United States, working, say, for, Facebook or Google or Amazon or in the tech industry or in medicine or some other high-skilled field, engineers, are looking at Canada as a permanent landing place. They have already settled in North America on their temporary visas, but looking at Trump sort of placing dramatic limits on those visas, making it harder and harder to see a path to citizenship or a path to permanent residency and a green card through those visas, are applying under the Express Entry program in Canada. I talked to a Canadian immigration lawyer in BC who said that she's getting huge numbers of inquiries from corporate clients about exactly that. These clients often have offices in both Canada and the US. And immigration lawyers say often these Canadian offices exist or are being expanded partly because being able to attract talent from around the world. If the United States is becoming a more hostile place and a harder place for those people to easily get in, do the work they want to do, settle with their families, then Canada is sort of a plan B for that.
That's actually exactly what I was going to lead into about what this means for Canada. Like you're saying, a lot of observers are saying that essentially Canada could have become everyone's plan B. So is that actually good news for us in terms of more skilled immigrants, more businesses, more opportunities?
I used to write about city issues a lot, and I would encounter people who talk about cities as being in sort of competitions with other cities around the world to attract capital, to attract labor, to attract, all the good things that make a city thrive. In broader society, we don't usually talk about immigration as as a sport, right? Where we're going to win because the other guys are losing or whatever. We're talking about human lives. And it seems somehow crass to talk about how bad news for immigrants in the United States may be good news for immigrants in Canada, or good news for Canada in any kind of way. There are moral and humanitarian dimensions to this that don't factor in. But in practical terms, purely practical terms, in terms of Canada having an objective of trying to attract the best and brightest workers from around the world to settle permanently in Canada, to potentially down the road become Canadian citizens, to be part of our culture, part of our knowledge base, part of the fabric of Canada, then absolutely it is a good thing for Canada if the United States is a harder place for those people to look at. Because, New York and San Francisco, everybody around the world knows those. They've all seen the same movies as us, right? They are singing Frank Sinatra songs to themselves as in the same way that people in Toronto and Calgary and Whitehorse are. And so if the dream of going to New York and making it there because is foreclosed, then maybe East York looks
it's an alternative.
As an alternative, for people who want to settle in North America and still have sort of the access to the North American marketplace of both ideas and of business.
If you follow these issues for a while, we know that it long predates Trump, and observers are saying it could be likely following the November 3rd presidential election as well, irrespective of who wins the election. Is it unlikely that the U.S. would increase its permanent residence allocation to a level that could satisfy the demand of aspiring skilled workers? And also come January 2021, I think the president and Congress would also be focused on America's pandemic recovery. So do you think anything might actually change on the immigration policy front, regardless of which administration it is?
I think things will change in the United States on the immigration policy front if Joe Biden were elected. But it may not be, as you point out, right overnight. And the kind of effects on immigration in Canada that we're talking about also wouldn't be as dramatic. We'd be unlikely to see skilled immigration to Canada drop as a result of the U.S. loosening its rules, because, as you say, the demand to come to North America and live and work remains very high. Now, the Democrats and Joe Biden have proposed some specific measures to increase skilled immigration, and fairly dramatically, and also to repeal a lot of the limitations on visa restrictions. But you're right, they wouldn't throw open the doors and say anybody in the world who wants to move here, just come right on in. And likely Canada would still be able to easily meet and exceed its own targets for skilled immigration.
We'll be right back. I want to bring our focus to another really important issue when we talk about immigration policies. When we're thinking about Trump's immigration policies, a lot of us are unconsciously thinking of asylum seekers and the humanitarian situation. And under Trump, seeking asylum in the US seems to have become next to impossible. And this has also intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is being used to block more people. So what has been the significance of that for Canada?
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is it's a really important distinction to draw. And when you talk to people who work in the immigration space, whether they're activists or whether they're lawyers, whether they're policymakers, they don't think of immigration and refugee issues as the same category at all, right? Like these are two different things. But certainly many people think of them as the same thing because it's people coming from elsewhere to here. And certainly Donald Trump kind of balls them all up into one big issue, right? So when he's talking about undocumented immigrants, people which he calls illegal immigrants, being deported from the United States, he's tying that together with people who are coming to the border seeking asylum because they face persecution or death where they are, because they're fleeing warfare, because they're fleeing famine, because they're fleeing horrifying, life-threatening conditions where they are. Asylum and refugee policy is basically governed internationally by a principle that says it is inhuman and immoral if somebody is fleeing an unjust persecution in the country they have been born in or the country they live in, if they are fleeing political persecution, if they're fleeing the likelihood of death or torture or inhumane treatment, that it's inhuman to deny those people a shelter. And so both Canada and the United States and most of the other countries in the world have signed into UN declarations agreeing to that principle. And yet, to some degree, most of the countries are hypocrites because they try to really limit the number of people who will be allowed to apply. You say, if somebody shows up at my front door and says, my life is in danger, can you let me stay with you? And you agree it would be immoral for me to say no, then building a wall at the end of your walk so that those people can never get to your front door is not really solving the problem morally, right? Many countries do that for practical reasons and political reasons. But Donald Trump has basically campaigned to his base to say that refugees, asylum seekers are criminals and savages and shouldn't be allowed in. And he's made it very difficult. You know, you have asylum seekers who are detained pending their hearing, sometimes for weeks or months, in conditions that the Supreme Court of Canada has said are such a violation of human rights that Canada is complicit in its safe third country agreement, which maybe we could talk about with the United States through that agreement, that Canada is guilty of these sort of human rights violations by association there or by participation. The result of that has been that there's a massive influx of asylum seekers looking to come to Canada instead, especially from the United States. Asylum seekers who are in the United States legitimately seeking refugee status or asylum status here in this climate and in these conditions have been trying to come to Canada. So there's a huge influx of those in the first place, and that is an issue for Canada. We may have a moral obligation in our own minds to allow those people to enter, but it does create administrative hassles, political hassles, just logistics of like how our system will process all those claims and settle those people. Beyond that, it's created a second thing. Canada has what's called the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States, which My understanding of it is that the basics of it are that because Canada and the United States are friends and we agree that we share a equally free and open democracy sort of status, any refugee applicant who arrives to Canada from the United States will be told to go back to the United States and seek asylum status there, right? You're already in a safe third country, right? You came from wherever you came from, you landed in the United States, you are now safe in the United States. And so rather than allow you to come into Canada and seek shelter here, we'll tell you to go back to the United States and pursue your asylum claims there. Now, because of that agreement, which again, the Supreme Court has said the United States treatment of asylum seekers is such that Canada is violating its own Charter of Rights by participating in that agreement. But asylum seekers have been looking at a loophole by trying to cross away from regulated border crossings, right? We have the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, famously, and much of it is not marked. There's no walls or fences, but in many places you can cross the border without ever seeing a border guard. There's nothing there. It's just an imaginary line in the forest or the water. And so lots of refugees, applicants, legitimately seeking, they're not trying to sneak into the country. They are crossing away from a border and then going to an RCMP officer or whoever they find and asking for asylum there, because there's a sort of a loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement where away from regular ports of entry, it doesn't apply. And so this irregular crossing issue is, again, something that the Canadian system wasn't really set up to handle. And whether or not any particular politician or person thinks that, again, we have a moral obligation to provide shelter to these people, there's a matter of resources, there's a matter of how the system is set up right now. And so that's created big backlogs in our own refugee policy. And so I think from a Canadian perspective, recognizing, everyone involved sort of recognizing that this is a humanitarian issue and a moral issue, and our obligations to the world and to ourselves based on our principles are what they are. That aside, it would be much easier if we had what we considered to be a good faith humanitarian partner in the United States helping us to fulfill that obligation rather than additionally burdening us by not being a safe partner in that.
But Ed, there's also been the observation that the Democrats might not have been all that different on that front. More deportations actually took place under the Obama administration than Trump's, as you also mentioned. How has Biden addressed that criticism?
You can certainly find people who say that they aren't all that different. Again, I'm not an expert on these things, but I think it's maybe more accurate to say they were not ideal. They are not innocent. Biden and Obama, especially Obama when he was president, was not best friend to asylum seekers and immigrant applicants in the world, but it was not on the same scale, and it's not the same thing in kind. For example, Trump has pointed out that those cages, those temporary holding facilities with chain link fences that he's been so targeted for detaining people in, children away from their parents for long terms, were built under the Obama administration, which is true. But what's also true is that they were built as 72-hour holding facilities. And the policy apparatus and the volume of applicants that were in place meant that in almost every circumstance, they weren't over full and people were not being detained there for weeks and months on end. Under Trump, that had become the case. And we've seen additional reporting this week that just builds on the case that was an intentional policy of the Trump administration. And Stephen Miller, a senior Trump advisor, his speechwriter, had really made the case that cruelty was the point, that to dissuade people from coming and seeking asylum in the United States, we need to make an example of these people who are coming and seeking asylum in the United States. And we'll do that from removing them, their infant children from them and locking them all up pending a hearing. Once again, these are people fleeing war and persecution. These are people coming to have their lives saved. Those are different things. And the numbers we're talking about are different too. Obama was often called the deporter in chief by immigration advocates. And while it was true that many people were deported under Obama, part of the reason why his numbers were so much higher than, say, George Bush before him was a classification question. They changed what qualified as a deportation, people being turned away at the border and returning to their country. I'm not an expert on all the details, but talking to experts and looking at some of the reports on these, it seems like part of the huge deportation numbers under Obama had to do with a change in how things were classified, like what got called a deportation. That said, and the other big difference that's been pointed out to me is that Obama's administration was really targeting undocumented immigrants who had criminal records and were otherwise identified as sort of a security risk and whatnot, whereas the Trump deportation policy, ICE raids, and has been intentionally much more indiscriminate, right? It's just seeking them all. And then, of course, you have the Dreamers Act, which is the people who came here as children, which Trump has been trying to repeal against the Supreme Court. All of that said, I think Joe Biden has basically, I have not heard him directly address Obama's record on it, but what I have seen is that his policy projects a change in immigration policy and specifically a change in asylum policy, like a dramatic change to welcome asylum seekers and all of that. Almost every political promise is a matter of like, do you believe him? Right? Do you believe what he says? Are these people going to actually do what they say they're going to do? My sense is that there would be a fairly dramatic change fairly quickly in the United States treatment of asylum seekers and its approach to asylum seekers, if for no other reason that because it's become such a symbol of the people who oppose Trump consider the treatment of asylum seekers such an important flagpole issue of what they find objectionable about Trump, that Joe Biden has basically talked about overturning and overhauling that entire policy area. And I think just in political terms, if for no other reason, he would want to show that he's done that fairly quickly. I think you would see a change that would be dramatic enough that people would notice it and people in Canada could see it. I don't think it would be what immigration and refugee advocates would consider to be an ideal world. Trump likes to say that Joe Biden is going to open up the borders, have completely open borders. There are some people who would like that or would like something much closer to that. I don't think Joe Biden is actually among them.
Just quickly, as we talked about a partial overhaul of the immigration system under a new administration, what would this mean in terms of Canada and its immigration system, or a further consolidation of what we are seeing now with the same administration? What's the blowback on the Canadian system and for Canadians?
I think the biggest change for Canadians, for the Canadian government, might be if that overhaul of the asylum refugee system that we were talking about was fairly dramatic, then a lot of that pressure we were talking about of people crossing at irregular crossings into Canada from the United States would, I would imagine, decrease significantly, right? And Canada's life, the administrator's life, would be much easier in dealing with that. As well, the concerns, I mean, Canada has a legal problem right now of trying to revise its policy in light of the Supreme Court's decision on the Safe Country Agreement. If the United States policy was overhauled, then that legal question goes away. And with it, the sort of moral qualms that many Canadians have about participating in the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States under the current circumstances. In terms of skilled immigrant policy, I mean, as we were talking about, it's a net asset to Canada in some terms, in like competitive terms. The pitch they can make to people around the world to say, come to Canada, is all the stronger if you have one less competitor making that pitch. I think Canada still has a strong pitch in those circumstances, but it would be in a more vigorous competition with the United States for skilled workers and other immigrants that it wants to attract if the United States were aggressively seeking to bring people in rather than sending the message from the highest office that it doesn't want them to come here.
Thank you so much, Ed. You've been very insightful, as always.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to hear a friendly voice from home.
That was the Star's Washington Bureau Chief, Edward Keenan, talking U.S. elections and immigration policy. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.